used some of those airfoil shapes to make some of the United States aircraft the most efficient in the world. And we certainly proved that during World War II. And certainly NASA was involved early on in, or NACA was involved early on in construction of aircraft engines and at its Lewis Research Center, and also for rocket propelled models. And they had a temporary Langley outpost at Muroc, California, which became known as the NACA Muroc Flight Test Unit, and it became the High-Speed Flight Research Station in 1954. Before the outbreak of World War II, NACA's research had both military and civil applications. During the war, however, its activity became mostly exclusive military, and its ties with industry also became much stronger. NACA's focus then was more on refining and solving specific problems rather than on advanced aeronautical knowledge. The major advance, however, was the development of laminar flow airfoil, which solved the problem of turbulence at the wing trailing edge that had limited aircraft performance. NACA also contributed to the development of the swept back wing, which we saw in later aircraft during the Korean War, specifically the F-86 Sabre jet. High-speed research after the war was often collaborated between NACA and the U.S. Army. In 1947, of course, we saw the breaking of the sound barrier by Chuck Yeager, and that was in a rocket plane developed specifically using the NACA probed characteristics of high-speed aerodynamics and stresses on aircraft structures. A lot of the German aeronautics and that we captured during World War II were used in conjunction with our tests, and that allowed us to really move to the forefront of aviation in terms of rocket and jet propulsion. And of course, in 1952, NACA was already thinking about aircraft that went very high, that had to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere at a high rate of speed, producing a great deal of heat. It was conceived that the blunt nose principle, which suggested that blunt nose shape would absorb only a very small fraction of the heat generated by re-entry of a body into the Earth's atmosphere. This principle was later significant in intercontinental ballistic nose cone and NASA Mercury capsule development. So we see a lot of things going on back in those days that would bring us up to really the forefront of space. Originally, most of what was happening with NACA prior to the space flights was the X-15 project, which really put us on the edge of space. And in 1958, NACA ceased to exist, October 1st, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration was formed largely in response to Soviet space achievements. So NACA became the nucleus of the new agency, and all NACA activities and facilities were folded into NASA. The major focus became space research, but aeronautics would remain as the first A in its name. So we're going to look a little bit here on some of the aircraft that were really the history of NASA. One of the first was of course, the cowling fitted on a Curtiss Hawk in 1928. So I'm going to give you a URL for that so that you can look at that picture. Now we can see from this photo that the cowling, which is the very front part that covers the engine, just behind the propeller, was responsible for giving this aircraft a much more streamlined, less drag, more efficient flying characteristics. And so that was the goal of NACA at that time. So even back in 1928, they were working towards more efficient wing shapes and also the cowling, which allowed the aircraft to fly faster. There's also an aircraft known as the Pitcam Autogyro, and I'll spell that for you here. P-I-T-C-A-I-M, and it was an auto gyro. Now, of course, this aircraft had some characteristics of a helicopter, but of course helicopters hadn't been fully developed, but certainly this aircraft, and let me get that link for you. Here's a picture of that aircraft. That aircraft, of course, is really the forefront of what we know as the helicopter. Even though it was an autogyro, the rotor blade would, of course, rotate, and then it had an engine on it as well that would cause the aircraft to move forward, and the rotor, as it rotated, basically became the airfoil and allowed the craft to fly. Early in World War II, extensive analysis of another aircraft that may be familiar to you, and that was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. It solved a lot of problems that were occurring in high-speed dives. So if you'll look at the P-38 in the next photo, you'll see a very efficient aircraft that NASA used to get rid of some of the problems that they had with what we know as compressibility. And Chuck Yeager had some major problems prior to the successful flight of the X-1 with compressibility. They solved the problem using a full-flying horizontal stabilizer, and that allowed them to then go ahead and be able to get into supersonic flight. There was many women that joined NACA, and we don't want to leave those folks out in terms of the recognition. They did a lot of research in building tunnel models, and one of the things they worked on were realistic tests of wings, and the photo I'm going to give you here shows a little bit of what went on there. And you'll see that that wing is from a flying boat. It's a small scale version of it, but in the wind tunnel tests, it really helped NASA be at the forefront of airfoil design. The North American P-51 Mustang was one of the first aircraft to use a NACA laminar flow airfoil, and that was tested at Langley Research Center in 1943. There is an example of that aircraft flying today, totally restored, and that is owned by a friend of mine here in town. His name is Bill Allman, And his restored NACA P-51 Mustang is the next photo I'm going to bring up. This aircraft took $750,000 US to restore, as you see it in this photo. Bill is a great guy, and he, of course, has to sustain his flying experience as a businessman. He owns all of the Taco Bells here in town. And so this is one of the few flying examples of a P-51 Mustang in the NACA colors. And if you look on the left wing, you'll see a number of structures that are sticking up. Some of those were used as instrumentation for checking and testing airfoils, and so Bill was faithful to the NACA aircraft in his restoring of this one. We talked about the airfoils, and back in really from 1908 to more modern times, 1944, we can